guess this is a good segue to Gillian Sorensen. You've spent a good bit of your career trying to drum up support for the United Nations, often in difficult political environment, especially within the United States. How do you think about this issue of United Nations accountability and integrity in an era in which so many people are looking for ways to undermine the legitimacy of the organization in one way or another?
Well, first let me thank you, Dan, for including me here with such a distinguished panel. I'm very happy to be here. And you're right, I've spent a lot of time on the road speaking about the United Nations as an advocate, a teacher, if you will, a defender, a debater, often before friendly audiences, but sometimes before audiences that are not so friendly, and on a few occasions before audiences that are actively hostile. It's been very interesting indeed. I do say to these audiences sometimes that the United Nations reflects the world as it is, not always as the world that we want it to be. I say that I'm a defender and supporter of the UN, but I'm not a UN romantic. And I think it's important that those of us who do believe in the United Nations acknowledge its flaws and its shortcomings. That is to say, build on the strengths, but address the weaknesses. Don't pretend they don't exist. Any crisis manager would tell you that when there is a problem, or a scandal, or a crisis, deal with it up front and soon. Don't pretend it doesn't exist. Don't pretend you can just put it aside, but address it, and early, and with a single message. I have felt that some of these crises, particularly oil for food, got totally out of hand, got totally misrepresented in the press, came to be seen among the American public as something that I didn't even recognize. So thoroughly was the reality of it distorted. This is very serious because the UN's credibility is at stake. It's a huge and complex organization. It is likely that somewhere, sometime, there are going to be misdeeds. If it's an individual staffer, that's one thing. Sometimes that can be handled internally. If it's a more serious or more senior misdeed, that has to be dealt with in a more public way. But absolutely, it needs to be done early and upfront. I think when UN staff are hired, there needs to be a much tougher presentation about what the standards are, what's expected. These are the high standards, and we stick to them, not just when it's easy, but when it's hard. And it is hard when these operations are in the most far-flung areas of the world, when there are financial issues for some operation 10,000 miles away from headquarters. But the standard for transparency and accountability has to be just as sharp for the overseas operations as it does for the headquarters operations. We do now have much stronger inspector generals in almost every activity of the United Nations, and I think it is a more accountable organization than it used to be. We all know, of course, that good news doesn't make news. Crisis makes news. And particularly, I don't know if it's this way overseas, but the American press will jump on any problem, crisis, or scandal and magnify it. And that's been particularly true in the last 15, 20 years from the right-wing press in this country. And during a period when UN bashing became a sort of popular sport, they would grab any opportunity and use it to demean and diminish the UN and imply that it was corrupt and incompetent and all the rest. That's why it's so important that the UN itself doesn't let incidents pass or grow beyond what they actually are. The good news is that I think there is a way to talk about the UN in a very realistic way. We do try to hit the highest mark that we can. We do try to hire the best people that we can. it does serve the national interest as well as the global interest. And we do hold our people accountable. That is very important for Americans to believe that it's a useful and effective organization. On the oil for food issue, there was a core item on that I felt was totally misunderstood. It was so easy to say the UN failed or Kofi Annan failed, when what actually failed, correct me if I'm wrong, please, was that there was a process for contracts, oil contracts, that passed through a Security Council committee,
Exactly.
a designated committee. The United States was one member of that committee, and that committee approved these various contracts as they came along. And that's where the flaw or the failure happened. So when you say the UN failed, you have to say who failed, what failed. Was it the Security Council? Was it some other committee? Was it some other operation? Put the blame, if you will, exactly where it belongs.
Well, that's very useful, and it complements Hans Corell's earlier point again about who's a representative of the United Nations in an organization that is, after all, not a free-floating bureaucracy, but is a collection of member states. And the relation of individuals to that is obviously very complicated.
There's one other sentence on this. The amount of money spent on the oil for food issue, it had to be done ultimately. It had to be clarified. And I always believed that Kofi Annan would be completely cleared. But I can tell you that was a very painful time for the Secretary General himself, for all of us who worked there. They nearly destroyed him over that. And perhaps if that had been handled faster, up front, in a different way, we could have been spared some of the pain and some of the exorbitant cost that we ultimately had to pay.
If I can just add one interesting footnote, is it hasn't ended. The oil for food investigations are still continuing. I have an unusual job. I was appointed to hold the key, literally, to the 13 million documents. And the requests have come in from a number of governments, from prosecuting authorities, for some of those documents to aid them in their prosecutions of corporations in their countries. About 30 going on in the United Kingdom at the moment. And my job is to advise the Secretary General on which of those documents can be shared and which cannot, because they were given to our committee in confidence. And that's coming to an end only at the end of 2013. So there's still a one-person office in the UN headquarters dealing with these documents, which will then be sealed for 50 years.
Could I perhaps add a footnote here? Since I was the one who negotiated the memorandum of understanding with Iraq that executed the Security Council's resolution. And I remember that when we negotiated, we said in my delegation, this is an extremely difficult task. We wonder whether the Security Council realizes what a difficult task they have given the Secretariat. And in particular, that the Secretariat didn't have 100% command over the administration of the program. As we heard here, there was a committee in the Security Council dealing with the contracts and so forth. And yes, Richard Goldstone mentioned here, there was one high official who was suspected, and he mentioned the sum of money there, and there were two others, I think, and they were brought to justice. But even $1 is too much. There has to be integrity among international civil servants, and to me it's unthinkable that you would even engage in any business of this kind. But what is never mentioned, in the US in particular, about the Oil for Food program, is the following. The program fed, for 7 years, 25 million people with humanitarian assistance. The turnover, I forget, I thought the figure was not fully 100 billion, but I thought it was 65 or 70 billion, but you may be right here. But what I remember before I left the UN was when the Security Council decided to wind up the Oil for Food program. The resolution meant that the Secretariat should hand over to the United States of America the residue the money left on the bank account for the oil for food. And so we did in November 2003, I recall. What did we hand over to the United States of America to be kept in a fund for Iraq? $8 billion, not million, $8 billion. Nobody can give a correct account or where that money went. That's where Hans Corell sees the scandal here. That is where the scandal is. And also the companies that played cahoots with Saddam Hussein and so forth. And I just hope that the investigations going on, that they lead to some results here, so that people can see really what happens here. Finally, Kojo Annan, yes, he was employed by Cotecna. But when we got word of that Cotecna got the contract, Joseph Conner, my American colleague who was head of the administrative department in the UN, we discussed this and immediately contacted the contract committee. Did they know that Kojo was employed by Cotecna? The answer was no. So when the contract was given to Cotecna, they didn't know that Kojo was employed by Cotecna. Then Kojo left Cotecna, so he said to his father, but it turned out that yes, he was not employed, but he received some monthly fee as a consultant. He didn't tell his father about that.